Cool. Hey, everyone, and thank you so much for all coming to my talk. I didn't expect as many people to show up. But yeah, I'm going to talk about using Houdini for game development today, and I've called the presentation Just Houdini It. I'm sure it will be clear later why. So, is this working? Oh. Before I get started, I just thought I'd give you a little background info about me. So I'm Sophie, and I'm currently a procedural technical artist at PlayStation London Studio. But it might be nice to know how I got into Houdini. I went to Breda University in the Netherlands, where I did an art course for games. And in my first year, I got to do a Houdini project where we had to make like a small scale environment for Houdini. And I was like, oh my God, this is awesome. This is what I'm going to do. So I just kept picking Houdini projects, and now I'm here. I'll quickly mention, before this, I was at Rebellion. I'm going to talk about some tools I did there later. So just so no one's confused about what's going on. But yeah, with that, what am I going to be talking about today? I'm not going to tell you how to get started in Houdini or about a super in-depth breakdown of tools, because I think there's a lot of really good resources out there for that. But I do want to talk about some things that I've had to learn over time, because I've been using, together with my university time, Houdini for about 6 years. So I hope I can share some of the lessons I've had to learn the hard way. So first, I want to quickly go over what it is that we actually can do with Houdini. And after that, I want to go over some very common misconceptions that are floating around about Houdini. I've had some of those, and other people that I've worked with had those. Then I want to talk about the consequences of these misconceptions. And then after that, I want to talk about what I think is the 4 requirements for making a good tool. Then I'll give you 2 examples for tools that I've made. And then after that, I'll finish up with some tips for using Houdini. So with that, let's just get started with what we can do with Houdini. I'm just going to cover some very broad ones. You can make placement and scatter tools with Houdini. For example, if you're going to make forests, you probably need to place a lot of trees, which would be very annoying to all do manually, but you could do something like that with Houdini. But what you can also do is scatter, I guess, more abstract things. So if you are making a forest and you wanted to scatter points where audio needs to spawn because there's birds in the trees, you could do that too. Or if you have flowers that are scattered, you could also scatter particles for bees that are flying along with the flowers. So yeah, you can kind of do that. Then you can also make curve tools. And what I mean by that is you give the user the chance to draw a curve in Engine, and then that curve gets used as a backbone for something. A curve tool can be a placement tool because you could have meshes. Let's say that we're making lots of fences and the artists have made some fence pieces and then they are placing them along the curve, but they don't have to do it by hand. But you could also use a curve as a backbone to generate geometry, such as pipe generators. They're very common as well, or cables. So that kind of leads me to our next point, which is asset generation. That can be very broad. You could generate rocks. You could generate pipes, like I said, or you could generate buildings. And there's not a right way to do something, but there's a right way to generate something for your project. For example, with a building generator, you could decide to do fully procedural geometry, fully procedural UVs, and just go full procedural. That could be an option. Or you could go fully placing instances along points and make it completely an instance building. Or you could do something that's more of a combination of the two, where, for example, you would create the whole of the building out of procedural stuff, but then you still place windows and billboards and stuff like that alone. You can also use Houdini as a sort of a pipeline tool, and then I mean anything that kind of speeds up the pipeline. So you could generate and set lot distances, or you could make like custom exporters. Or a few years ago, they made this new thing in Houdini, which is procedural dependency graphs, where you can have nice step-by-step processes of bringing other processes together and like have nice steps of your pipeline. So that's really cool as well. Then you can also make terrains with Houdini, and you can like generate the height maps, get the actual terrain. But what you can also do is have masks on that terrain that you can use for other attributes. Let's say that you have a really steep slope on a terrain. You don't want to scatter your trees there, so you can exclude that mask. But you can also use it for materials. You can do a lot more stuff with terrains, but I don't want to cover everything too in depth. And then the obvious one that everyone knows about is VFX. And you can do all sorts of VFX, like destruction and water, like I said, and lots of other ones. And you can optimize those for games too. I'm not a VFX artist, so like I'm not the best person to talk about those. And then there's lots and lots of other things you can do with Houdini. Like they have lots of cool rigging and character tools, but I haven't really worked with those, so I didn't want to cover them in too much depth. Cool. So then I want to talk about some misconceptions. The biggest one I've probably heard is we can do real-time generation with Houdini, right? You can't do real-time generation with Houdini. You can make a tool that works in engine and you can generate stuff in engine, but you can't make it real-time. A lot of people want to do that to give the player a unique experience. Like if you have Minecraft, which everyone probably knows, every time you load a new world, you have a new world. You can't do that with Houdini, but if you want to do something like that, the closest you could probably get is if you have a level generator, you pre-generate 100 outputs. And then once you have those 100 outputs, you ask a coder to help you make it into something where one of those levels gets picked every time someone loads. It's not quite real-time generation though, but it's something that I've considered before. Another one is, if we use Houdini, the performance will magically be good, right? Can you just Houdini the performance? It's not that Houdini means bad performance. You can definitely make things that are good performance with Houdini. But if you don't think about it, you can still make super high poly geometry, or you can make really expensive, complex materials, or have attributes left over on it that just clog things up. And it can still be a non-performant asset. So yeah, it's just something to keep in mind. You can do it, but it doesn't magically happen just because it's Houdini. Then another one, I think sometimes I suffer with that still, is that once you have Houdini, everything must be Houdini, right? And that's from multiple perspectives. It can be someone who's never had to use Houdini tools and who would use those tools. And now they're like, oh God, are all my nice tools going to be replaced by Houdini tools? That's not necessarily true. Then it might be someone who's actually invested time and money into getting Houdini licenses. And they're like, right, this was a big investment. We must now use it for everything. Or it can be someone like me who makes Houdini tools, who just kind of thinks, yes, this is the tool I know. This is what I'm going to do. That doesn't always make sense because I could make some procedural tileable materials in Houdini, but it probably makes much more sense if I do it in Substance Designer, which is specifically for that. Then there's also this idea that you can have very ambitious but open-ended ideas. And it's kind of like, we don't need a concept, right? You can just Houdini it. I think even I, in the beginning, sometimes thought that. And it's a really hard one to work with because let's say that someone comes up to me and goes, can you just make a level generator? I'm like, yes, what does that mean? I'm like, I don't know, some outdoor stuff, terrain. Cool, what else? Maybe some paths or something. I'm like, cool, but how do they work? Good luck. Thanks, guys. A terrain could be flat, like the Netherlands, no elevation. Or we could have the French Alps, a lot of elevation. And there's a lot of stuff in between there. And a path could go from A to B with just start points. Or it could be fully controlled. So with art and with tech, we have set guidelines and standards, right? For art, we have a pipeline. We have a concept, we have reference, and we work from there. And for tech, we also have coding standards and just standards you need to follow. But because Houdini and tech art is sort of in the middle, people think that you can just wing it. Sometimes I think I can just wing it, but that doesn't always work out. So if you think that for something your artists need to have concepts and reference, then your Houdini person probably also needs those concepts and reference. And the same thing goes for the standards, how it needs to perform in game. Then the next one is if you don't have any standards. What I mean by that is even Houdini users among each other kind of think like, oh, well, we're all using the same nodes, right? So someone else who picks this up one day will just follow what's going on. But that can get really messy as well. For example, if you have very, very different ways of doing your UI, I'll get back to it in a little bit. It can be hard for a user as well if everyone does their documentation differently. So that can be a bit harmful for your development too. And then there's this idea that you can just quickly make it, right? You can just quickly Houdini some lots for us. And I can make some lots for them. I can't Houdini them. I can't quickly make them. I still need to plan this. Because it's just this idea that Houdini isn't that complex, because you see all these really, really cool things that people have done with it. But no one seems to realize how hard it actually is to make something. Because even I, when I did my first Houdini project, I was like, I'm going to make a city generator. And you end up maybe just barely doing the roads because you have very limited time. So yeah, that's also something that comes up a lot. So now I'm going to talk a bit about the consequences. Some of them might have some overlap and they won't be specific to one of those misconceptions. The first one is it can be really, really hard to plan. If, for example, you have an open-ended tool where you don't know what you're doing. If someone goes, can you make a level generator? And you don't know what that means, then it's very hard to break down how you're going to do that work. So it's important to have a good breakdown of the steps you want to take. And also, if there's a really open-ended idea, it's very easy for feature creep to just come along because someone's like, oh, while you're on that, can you also add this? And you're like, yeah, sure. Which then can also lead to having inorganic tools, because if something just gets like mushed in the last minute, it's usually not very easy to work with. And it kind of happens when the idea is very open-ended and then you get some feature creep and you need to stuff it all in. Or I could do something like use Houdini for making procedural materials rather than Substance Designer. It probably feels a bit inorganic. So then it could also end up to having wasted time. Because if I make a tool that's hard to use or it doesn't quite do what it needs to do, no one's going to use that tool. Same thing if I don't document it. No one's going to understand how to start with that. So then you spend a lot of time making all these tools, but no one knows how to use them or they don't do what they need to do. You can also have an unsatisfying output in every sense of the word. Like I mentioned, if you don't quite know what your goal is that you're going to, because it's very open-ended, someone might be like, oh, yeah, I don't know what the output was I was expecting, but it wasn't this. Or if someone just thought that we can magically Houdini the performance, if someone hasn't kept that in mind, you can actually get something that doesn't really run that well in game. There can be a lack of coherence. This is kind of what I mentioned, having no standards. If person A writes their documentation and person B records a video, and person C doesn't make any documentation at all, it's very difficult for the end users of the tools to understand how to start using them, but it can also harm both the users and the developers of the tools. So in this screenshot, it's not important to look at the numbers or the sliders, but my point is, in the top one, someone has made different sections of the tool in tabs. In the bottom one, someone has made them in collapsible folders. Then one of the tools, the top one is made with having parameters in snake case. The bottom one is having Pascal case. I think mostly how the layout is of the tabs can be confusing to someone who needs to use it because they're not sure if it means the same thing, especially then the third person comes along and it's like, which one do I use for which? And they start using them both. And the casing is mostly annoying if someone else has to use your tool, because then if you don't follow standards, it's really hard to keep up with what we're doing and to reference parameters. And then the worst thing that can probably happen, in my opinion, is when all of these things come together and people are like, right, this tool doesn't quite do what it needs to do. It's very hard to use. I don't understand what to do with it. No one's using it, so it was a waste of time. Let's never use Houdini again. So we want to avoid that at all costs, right? Because we can actually do all these cool things. So now that the grim bit's done, I want to talk about the 4 things that I think are important for a tool. And the first one being to have a clear goal. So it's important to formulate what problem am I trying to solve before you even start thinking about what tool you're making. And then when you know the problem, you can start thinking about an input or an output. I'll give an example in a little bit. And then once you have that input and output of your tool, then you can start thinking about the level of control. Because at this point, you probably know who the user will be of your tool, let's say an artist. And then when you know who the user is, you can ask them how much control they will. Let's say that we're making a tool that scatters trees for forests. I want to know how much control they want over how many different trees they want to scatter. If they need to control how dense those trees get scattered, or do they just want a randomize button, and is that just enough? So with that, I also really need user testing so I can get feedback, because I can test a lot of stuff myself, and I can test if it has bugs. But if I'm making a tool for an artist, I'm not like super artistic, so it will probably look very bare bones. So if a user starts making it and they actually start outputting what they want to make, they can tell me first of is the output what they want. Do the parameters do what they expect? Do they have enough control? Is it fully overkill? Have I given them way too much control and now it's hard to use it? When I just have nice catch-ups with the users to see what they think of the current state of the tool, I can make a lot better tool. And then the last one, visual guidelines. Like I mentioned, if you want your artist to make something, you usually give them concept art or at least reference. So if you want a Houdini artist to make something, then you probably want to give them at least a sketch that's been made in a meeting, or it's even better if you have a concept for them. Or sometimes it can be something that you've previously done manually, and now you want to automate it. That's great, because then you see exactly what it kind of needs to be like, and you can ask people questions about how they've done it manually. So with that, I'm going to go to an example. When I was working at Rebellion and I just started, someone came up to me and they said, it's taking a really long time for us to create trees and we can't use SpeedTree. So can you look into tree creation a little bit for game development? And I was like, cool, I can do that. That sounds like a really cool task. But then I also realized that, like, let's say that I had 4 weeks, I probably wasn't going to make a new SpeedTree on my own. So because of that, I thought it would be important to break this down and find where the pain points were of this pipeline. And when I spoke to the vegetation artists, they said it was taking a really long time to place individual leaves along the branches that can then get baked and later placed as cards. So with that, I started doing research. I started finding tools that did this or made whole trees. And then I started to kind of break down that research. And I like to do something like this, where I write down all the tools that I find, and then I break it down in categories that seem relevant to me. So I can look at who will use this tool, who's the user, how expressive is it, how much control do they have, can they do exactly what they want? And then I want to know if there's a high learning curve for someone to pick up this tool and how the responsiveness is. And what I mean by that is, do I change a parameter and something changes instantly? Or do I change a parameter and I need to set off a bake? So when I have this, then I can also think about what my ideal tool is. In this case, it would be, I want an artist to use the tool, then I want it to be highly expressive. I want the learning curve ideally to be low, but if it must be medium, and I want the responsiveness to be high. And with that, because I've seen all these other tools that do something, I can write down the things that are really, really good about this tool and would be helpful for us, and things that I think maybe are missing and we need. So with that in mind, I went back to the vegetation artists, and then I talked with them about this input and output of the tool. So I proposed that they would still make manually their leaves and their branches, because they can probably do that much better than I could do it procedurally, and it just wouldn't work. And then the tool would, for them, place those leaves along the branches, and we discussed the level of control. What was important for us was that it didn't have to 100% finish these leaves along the branches, but it was really good if it still did 80 to 90% of the work, and then they had to make some manual changes. So with that, we decided that the output would be an FBX, where we can still click every individual leaf and still change them or delete them if we need to. So with that, I started making a tool. And as you can see, I'm not so artistic that I can make really good looking branches, but I did test all the things that they asked me for. And then when I did that, I asked them to test it, and they made something that looks a lot more like an actual branch. And And then with that, I also got a lot of feedback, actually. There was obviously a few things like, hey, can you add this parameter? But the most important thing I heard was probably that the UI was very big. And there was a lot to scroll through, and it was quite hard to find the parameter they were going for. So then instead, I actually made a script with Python viewer states in Houdini that lets you actually add handles in the viewport. And by doing that, suddenly they could just control it a lot easier with just 2 buttons on the keyboard and their mouse. And then it was a lot easier to use. So what could go wrong with a tool like this? It was kind of open-ended. Can you research trees for a little bit? And if I didn't have as much experience as I did at that point, I could have gone off and researched for a really long time. Or I could have been really ambitious and gone, I can make speed tree. But I thought that probably wouldn't be a good idea, which is why I started to break it down so I could then plan it. Because if I know I'm doing a leaf placement tool, I can then plan time for research, and I can plan time to actually make this tool and get feedback and then iterate. If I would have done something really, really open-ended, I guess, and just winged it, I could get a lot of feature creep. I could still get that with this. Someone could come up to me and say, hey, can you put some flowers at the end of some of the branches? It's like the pink blobs that I made in my screenshots. I hand placed them. I didn't actually do that. If someone would ask that, I could say, yeah, I can do that, but does it make sense to do that? Maybe it's just as easy to manually do that, and it would take less time. Or someone could go, that's cool. I actually need the same control for my baked branches that then go on the 3D branches. You can just make a UI for that, right? You can quickly do that. And it's not to say that I can't do that, but it's not one of those, oh, you can quickly do that. So if someone comes up to me with that request, I could then say, yes, we can explore that further, but let's do this first. Or there could be no feedback coming from the tool. That can be for various reasons. I could be very shy and be too scared to give my tool because it's never ready. Or it could be someone who's maybe never worked with Houdini before and who doesn't know where to start. I've had it a few times just over the past years that someone doesn't really pick up a tool. And what I find works best is to just plan some time with them to show them the tool so they can try and they can ask questions, and you get a bit of a connection with them, and then they can feel a bit less intimidated by using Houdini. So yeah, there's that. Then I have another example. When I was working at Rebellion on Sniper Elite 5, we were coming to our sort of optimization stage. And one of our other tech artists found that some of the assets weren't being called at all. And this was affecting our performance. So obviously, we're not going to go up to an artist and go, yeah, can you just figure it out and do it one by one? So I thought it would be easy to automate it. But before I did that, I wanted to have clear input and output because we had the problem. The assets weren't being called. Then the input was fairly straightforward. All our assets. Then the output was some of these assets need to be called. Which ones? So that's where I started to define my goal more clearly. I wanted to have a user-controlled bounding box of the asset so I could pick how big the assets were that were being called. And I wanted a rough screen space calculation. So with that, sorry, I lost my train of thought. With that, I went back to my input and output. I now knew what my output was as well. So because of that, I thought a really good way to approach this would be to use the procedural dependency graphs in Houdini that I showed a screenshot of in the beginning. Because doing that gave me a very nice way to approach things step by step. And also, in that bit of Houdini, you can send Python commands to a server, and I didn't have to worry about what software I was calling. So with that, I started. And if you do something like this, I would always recommend to work on a small group of assets. I think I picked about 10 or something. Because first of all, if you're testing, you don't want to run something on thousands of assets. It would take really long. But also, it probably won't go right straight away. And you don't want to break the game. So do it on a small group of assets. Then once you're going, obviously, you do expand a bit on your goal. Like what happens when we already have a goal distance? But you can kind of work this out because you have a pretty clear goal. And the cool thing about this is, because it was made in the system that it was made in, we could expand on it. Not feature creep, but expand. So we could say in the future, maybe we could also use this system to set our lot distances. Or if we don't have the lot yet, maybe we can even generate lots. And then we don't have to worry if we're generating them in Houdini or in some other software, because we can just send commands. So that's a really nice way of going about it. Cool. So with that, I now want to go over to some tips. My first one probably won't surprise you, is to have standards and guidelines. It's not that you have to have hard standards for everything, but they're there to help you to get started, right? So one of the things is how to name your tool so people can easily find them and what folder structure to put them in. For example, you could go input to output. So curve to fence. That's pretty clear what that does, right? And then also you could color your nodes in Houdini. I quite like that. I kind of made this up on the go, but I've made all the group nodes yellow, just so every time someone selects a group, I know where that group's at and I can find it easily. Then also it's nice to have some sort of guidelines on how you do your documentation, just so you make sure that everyone does their documentation, and yeah, people can just learn from it quite easily. Then another one is thinking about your tool breakdown. This is kind of a big point because obviously with Houdini tools, it all comes down to problem solving and breaking down problems. Because if I say that I am going to make a city generator, I should probably break that down first. If I'm going to make a city generator, I probably want to lay out the city with how the roads are. And I want to make the roads, make the buildings, make some parks. And then even with them, I can break them down smaller. Like if we have a road tool, I could probably break them down into even smaller tools. If it's based on a curve, I will always probably have a curve cleanup in some sort of way. And because I make a lot of curve tools, I can then use that same tool every time. Then I will also probably have some custom attributes that I'm setting up. And I might do some sort of custom copy that I use a lot. And the nice way of doing this is actually a lot of stuff. So the first one being, if you have a bug in one of those tools later, or you need to add something, if you're that person that goes into an old tool and copy paste stuff into another tool, suddenly you have to remember where all those things are and where you need to add this bit or change this bug. And you don't have to do that if you have small reusable tools. And it's also really helpful for collaboration. Because if someone on your team maybe hasn't used Houdini as much, it's nice for them to almost have kind of building blocks to start working with. And Houdini also lets you see what's in those building blocks so they could learn from it. But then also, let's say that I am making a city generator and I have 5 to 8 smaller tools. Technically, I can now work on it with 5 to 8 different technical artists because we won't have purpose conflicts. We can all work on our own bit of the tool. So it can just be really helpful to break it down into smaller tools. I'm not a coder, but I almost think about it like with code, where you don't do one giant function for one thing, but you have smaller things that you use to build with. I kind of like doing the same thing with Houdini, and you have to find the balance of what's a big enough tool to make into a tool, and just work that out for your project. Then I also think it's really important to do tool reviews. Because first off, I mentioned the user reviews. It's important to get feedback, and they are going to give you better feedback than when I'm just doing bug testing, right? We kind of saw that already. And then it's also really important to do technical reviews for a bunch of reasons. The technical reviews can see if you're following enough standards, so it's still clear to follow, but they can also see if your output is being optimized, or maybe if you're thinking about a problem way too complex and it's much easier. The amount of times that I've shown a tool to someone and they've gone, what have you done here? There's just one node for that. I'm like, oh, cool, thanks. And then also, if you do tech reviews, it's really helpful because if I'm off sick for a week and someone really needs to work on that tool, if I've had a tech review, someone will know kind of about that tool and they'll be able to pick up work that needs to be done now because someone already knows. And then if you want to do these reviews, I would say it's very important to plan when you are going to do them. I kind of mentioned it before. When I started, I found it really, really scary to ask for feedback. So I was like, no, tool's not ready yet. We can't review it. And if you set a point beforehand, you know that it's going to happen and it's going to be fine. So I would say that's important for user reviews. Also, while you're still prototyping, because maybe you're doing a prototype that actually really doesn't work the way that they want. And then you can address it early on. And the same thing goes for tech reviews. You might be doing something that's really going to catch you later down the line, but someone else might see it if you didn't. So it's important to just plan it when. I'm not going to tell you when to do it. It can be whenever works for your studio. It can be at the end of a Jira or at the end of a sprint, the start of a sprint, whatever works. And then my last tip is to have time for research and for learning and development. So first off, when you're doing tech art, you obviously have to keep up with all the art changes that are constantly coming in, all the tech changes. So that's one of them. But also, Houdini has a new version fairly often. So it's nice to just research what the new thing is. And then also, I bet there's a lot of buttons that if you use Houdini, you've never clicked on. I've been using it for 6 years, and I can't say that I know Houdini back to front. I know how to find my way around in it, but it's not that I know every button. So I like to just click buttons that I've never clicked and see what they do. And when I go in to edit a tool, I bet everyone just clicks on the parameter tab because that's what your users are going to see. But there's so many other tabs there. That's how I found out that you can add Python scripts to your tool. If I hadn't done that, maybe I wouldn't have known that I can make custom handles for my leaf placement tool. And then also, if I hadn't done research, maybe I would have felt very intimidated about doing this procedural dependency graph stuff because I kind of heard about it. But I was like, oh, I'll need it one day, not now. So it's important to just do your learning and development time. It can just be watching tutorials. Sometimes I'm like, well, cool, that doesn't sound like a super complex asset. But I'll still watch the tutorial because surely they are doing something that I don't know about. So I would say to just spend time on that because it's super, super valuable for a technical artist development. So if you're here and you're not a technical artist, please understand that we do need time to do research and to set up guidelines and that sort of stuff. So I do think that kind of rushed through it. But thank you so much for coming to my talk. And I will be around. You can come chat to me. If you have other ideas, I would love to hear them. And if you don't want to chat to me now, you can also chat to me on LinkedIn. So yeah, thank you so much for coming. Does anyone have any questions now?
Hi. Hello. There we go. Hi, thanks for the talk. Yeah, interesting stuff. I just wonder what your approach would be to integrating Houdini into a pipeline that uses an engine like Unity to leverage power of procedural level generation or even foliage placement. How would you get that data out of something like Houdini and then into something like Unity?
So if I was doing that, the first thing I would do is seeing how I get Houdini engine working in Unity before I even start thinking about making a specific tool in it, just to see if I can get an output in Unity. And then after, I'm going to see if I can make some sort of tool and change the parameters and if they react. And then when I know, cool, this is possible, then I would probably try to do some sort of standards. Standards don't have to be there forever, right? You can iterate on them. So if you're not quite sure, I think it's important to have standards, at least so you have something to hold on to and you're all working in the same sort of direction. And then after that, you can change them when you learn more. I would also say someone's probably done a tool similar to what you've wanted to do. So that's why I mentioned it's so important to research, because otherwise I might end up just redoing the same thing. Does that help?
Yeah, that's
okay,
great.
Cool.
Thank you for the talk. That was fantastic. And I thought it was interesting that you mentioned that in the beginning, there is a tendency to just Houdini it for everything. Yeah, and I feel like definitely it's quite common to feel like, oh, I've got a hammer and everything looks like a nail.
Yeah.
So would you be able to recommend any specific use cases where you definitely shouldn't be using Houdini for something?
I don't know one from the top of my head, but it's kind of, that's why I think it's important to work together with your tech team as well, because maybe I know that substance designers are around, but because I'm in Houdini all day, every day, I might think that's a really good idea to do those textures, like I mentioned, but someone else might catch that. So that's why I would talk to other people if you have an idea about a Houdini tool, because they might go, oh yeah, that's cool, but we can just do a tool in Maya for that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Great talk, by the way. So thank you for that. Aside from that, my question is more of working with a team, especially with source control, when you're working on big projects with Houdini, and especially focusing on PDG and how we can harness multiple PCs to go through and basically get our workflow just faster. So what is your personal experience on it, and what more ideas do you have for a technical artist that just uses Houdini?
Yeah, so I haven't used PDG loads yet. I started kind of using it on the thing that I mentioned, and I just thought it would be a good place to start. But again, I would just try to see if something works first before you're gonna make the tool that you're thinking about making, right? So if you know that you need to do something over multiple PCs overnight, try to see if you can do it. It doesn't have to be something long, right? If it's something that's safe to test during the day in a few minutes, I would just do that. So if something breaks, then you can check then why. And then if I know that's working, I'll probably just start doing the first step and just keep checking along the way. I would also say there's, like I mentioned, there's so many resources out there. There's loads of tutorials on YouTube, but people also do blogs. And there's a really great Houdini Discord channel as well. There's a Think Procedural channel, and it has so many different topics. You can have general, PDG specifically, Python, VFX. So I would recommend just being on there. And if you can share your work, just share your work. Because there's definitely people who've done what like you're trying to do.
Cool, thank you. What about versioning your HDAs, especially when you want to keep that like versioned in Perforce? Have you had any nightmare stories with that? Or how would you keep it in check?
Not personally, but I've heard people who've had that. There's like a versioning system in Houdini, because in the HDA files, you can have multiple tools. So you can change the versioning number at the end, and you can even change the namespace, because if you're working with other studios and they have the tool with the same name, you can get conflicts, but you can do a namespace, like the name of your company, tool, and then version number. So that can be really helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you for bringing it all the way over here. By the way, awesome talk.
Thank you.
I've been a tools developer before, and I forget that all those things that I've applied before, in a way, sort of like makes me like, oh, cool. I technically done some technical artist work. It's awesome.
Cool.
So for somebody that doesn't know Houdini, that's just starting, like imagine like you're a teacher, like what kind of like ideal like first project to like really like teach us like the fundamentals. Because I remember I installed Houdini one time and I saw a sea of buttons. I'm like, oh
Yeah.
shit, this is quite overwhelming.
I get
Like,
that.
what would you suggest?
It kind of depends on what you want to do, because I normally say I think it's quite a nice way to learn about procedural modeling. But if you just want to do VFX, you can do VFX. But it's just, I would not be too scared to do something wrong, because you can't really do something wrong. You're just learning, right?
True.
So the first thing that I probably learned about was like, oh, right, there's this geometry spreadsheet where I can see all this data. What can I do with my point data? And then also there's so many good tutorials out there. If you're more of a reading person, there's a CG Wiki where someone's just written down a bunch about different parts of Houdini. But for example, if you're more of a video person, there's Indie Pixel on YouTube, and they do really nice bite-sized sort of tutorials, and they break it down into small videos, which can make it seem really approachable to start working with it. And I would mostly suggest to just pick something that you find really fun. It doesn't have to be useful straight away, but if you actually love the thing that you're making, it'll be a lot easier to keep working on it. And then my last tip is probably to manage your expectations. Like I said, I thought, oh, cool, I'm going to make a whole city generator in 8 weeks. And I was also learning Houdini because I was a student, and I ended up making like the roads. So just like pick something that you think will have your interest long enough that you think you can also do in like a amount of time.
Thank you very much.
Anything else? Don't mind if not.
Can you explain more about the culling tool that you work on again? Sorry, just a generic question about the culling tool that you worked on.
Not really, I guess, because it's kind of still under NDA, so I approved what I could say about it. But yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. I mean, if no one has any questions, then I'm happy to call it a day. Sorry for rushing through it. Cool.